Sometimes the secrets we inherit are the heaviest burdens we carry, and sometimes the answers we've been afraid to find are the only things that can set us free. For 62-year-old Trudy Halvern, that truth was locked behind a brick wall in a Montana cellar for 120 years. Her grandmother fled this stone homestead during a blizzard in 1905 and never looked back. The family never spoke of what happened that night. Now Trudy stands at the cellar door with her grandfather's journal and an old iron key. When she finally breaks the seal, what she finds inside will change everything she thought she knew about her family and herself. What could make a woman abandon her home and never return? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air in the Bitterroot Valley carried the scent of pine and coming rain. Trudy Halvern stood at the edge of the property she'd sworn never to visit again, her weathered hands gripping a leather journal that smelled of old paper and her grandfather's pipe tobacco. 30 years she'd lived in these mountains, but always miles away from this place, always keeping her distance from the stone homestead that sat like a silent witness to family secrets nobody wanted to name. She was 62 now, her face lined by decades of mountain wind and solitary living. Her hair, more silver than brown, was pulled back in a practical braid. She wore the same kind of clothes she'd worn for 30 years, canvas work pants, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, boots that had been resoled twice. Her hands were strong from splitting wood and working timber, from building her own cabin and living off the land in a way most people only read about in books. The homestead before her was exactly as she remembered from childhood visits. Stone walls 2 feet thick, built to withstand Montana winters that could kill a person in an hour, windows with their glass still intact but clouded with age, a roof that sagged in the middle but hadn't yet collapsed. The whole structure sat in a clearing surrounded by lodgepole pines, with the mountains rising up behind it like the backbone of the world. And there, on the north side of the house, the cellar door, brick and iron, sealed shut with mortar that had hardened over more than a century. Trudy had left civilization in her early 30s after her daughter died. The girl had been only 3 years old, pneumonia that came on fast and took her faster. Trudy's husband hadn't been able to handle the grief. He'd left within 6 months, and Trudy had followed him out the door of their suburban life. But while he'd gone to find himself in bars and other women's beds, she'd gone to the mountains to lose herself entirely. She'd built a cabin with her own hands on a piece of land 20 miles from the nearest paved road. She'd learned to trap and fish, to preserve food and split firewood, to read the weather in the sky and find water in the driest season. She'd spent 3 decades speaking to almost no one, trading furs and woodwork in town twice a year for the few supplies she couldn't make or grow herself. It was a good life, in its way. Clean and simple, and free from the complications of people and their expectations, free from the possibility of loving someone and losing them. Her grandfather had understood. He'd been the only one who never tried to talk her out of leaving, never suggested she was running away or hiding from life. He just helped her buy the land and told her to write when she could. She had, once or twice a year, brief letters that said little but meant everything. He died 6 months ago, heart attack, quick and clean, the way he would have wanted it. He was 93 and had lived every one of those years on his own terms. The lawyer had sent her a letter. She was the only living heir. Everything came to her. His small house in town, his savings, and a locked box with instructions to open it alone. Inside the box had been this journal. Trudy opened it now, standing in front of the homestead, and read the first entry again, her grandfather's handwriting, still steady even in his final months. Trudy girl, if you're reading this, I'm gone. There are things you need to know. Things I should have told you years ago but didn't because I thought silence was kindness. I was wrong. The truth is never easy, but it's always better than shadows. Go to the old homestead. There's a cellar door on the north side that's been sealed since before I married your grandmother. Inside that cellar are answers to questions our family stopped asking a long time ago. I'm giving you a key, literally and otherwise. Use it. Don't make the same mistake I did and let fear keep you from the truth. The past can't hurt you, sweetheart. Only running from it can. The journal contained other entries, scattered thoughts from different years. References to her grandmother, who died when Trudy was just a girl. Mentions of the night of the storm and what happened before, and the women who understood. Cryptic notes about property deeds and name changes and fresh starts. And on the last page, a hand-drawn map of the homestead property with 3 X marks, one at the cellar door, 2 others on the property grounds. The iron key had been taped to the inside back cover. Trudy had sat with that journal for 3 weeks, reading and rereading it, trying to decide what to do. She could walk away. She could burn the journal and the key and go back to her cabin and her solitary life. Nobody would ever know. Nobody would ever ask. But her grandfather's words kept circling in her mind. The past can't hurt you, sweetheart. Only running from it can. She'd been running for 30 years. Maybe it was time to stop. The town of Ironwood Valley hadn't changed much in the decades she'd been gone. Main Street still had the same general store, the same diner, the same gas station with 2 pumps and a mechanic who could fix anything made before 1980. The population held steady around 800 people, big enough to have a school and a post office, small enough that everybody knew everybody else's business, or thought they did. When Trudy had driven through 2 days ago to pick up supplies, she'd felt the eyes on her. People recognized her, or recognized her truck at least. The old green Ford that had been her grandfather's before it was hers. They'd nodded politely but hadn't approached. Mountain folks knew how to respect another person's privacy. But she'd heard the whispers. That's the Halvern girl. Heard she's been living like a hermit up in the high country. Wonder what brought her back. One person hadn't whispered. Emmett Rawdon had been coming out of the Historical Society building when she'd passed, his arms full of old newspapers and bound documents. He'd stopped dead in the middle of the sidewalk and stared at her like she was a ghost. They'd been close once, before she left. More than close. They'd talked about marriage, about building a life together. But when her daughter died and her world fell apart, Emmett had tried to hold her together with reason and plans and gentle insistence that time would heal things. He'd been wrong. Time didn't heal it, just put distance between you and the pain. And Trudy hadn't wanted distance, she'd wanted erasure. So she'd left him standing in a parking lot 30 years ago with an engagement ring in his pocket and hurt in his eyes. Now here he was, older, but still recognizably Emmett. Tall and lean, his hair gone grey at the temples, lines around his eyes that suggested he still smiled despite whatever disappointments life had handed him. He wore jeans and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, glasses perched on his nose. He'd worked at the Historical Society even back then, fascinated by the valley's past, by the stories of homesteaders and miners and the hard people who'd carved civilization out of wilderness. He'd probably been here all these years, cataloguing and preserving and making sense of history. They'd looked at each other across 20 feet of sidewalk, and Trudy had seen the question in his eyes. She'd given a small nod acknowledgement, nothing more, and kept walking, but she knew she'd see him again. This was a small town, and if she was going to start digging into her family's past, Emmett's knowledge of local history would be invaluable, whether she wanted his help or not. Now, standing in front of the sealed cellar door, Trudy pulled the iron key from her pocket. It was old, blackened with age, but still solid. The kind of key that fit locks nobody made anymore. The brickwork around the door was crude but effective. Someone had mortared it shut with real determination, sealing every gap, making sure nothing got in and nothing got out. 120 years of Montana weather hadn't broken that seal. But Trudy had brought a hammer and a chisel. She had time and determination and a need for answers that had been building since she opened her grandfather's journal. She set her tools down on the ground and stood for one more moment, looking at the sealed door. Somewhere behind it were the answers her grandfather wanted her to find. Somewhere in that darkness was the truth about why her grandmother had fled this place during a blizzard in January 1905 and never spoken of it again. Somewhere in there was the reason for 120 years of family silence. Trudy picked up the hammer and chisel and stepped forward. It was time to break the seal. The first blow sent a shock up Trudy's arm and barely chipped the mortar. The second did better, creating a small crack along the brick line. By the 10th blow, sweat was running down her back despite the cool morning air, and a satisfying section of mortar had begun to crumble away. She worked methodically, the way she did everything. No wasted motion, no frustration when progress came slowly. She'd learned patience from 30 years of mountain living, where rushing got you hurt and steady work got you through winter. It took her 3 hours to break enough of the seal to pry the door open. The iron hinges screamed when she pulled, a sound that sent ravens exploding from the nearby pines. Rust showered down like red snow. The door fought her, but Trudy had muscles built from years of hard living, and she won. The opening exhaled cool air that smelled of stone and earth and something else, something preserved, like old paper or dried flowers. Trudy pulled a flashlight from her pack and shone it into the darkness. The cellar was bigger than she'd expected. Stone walls extended back 15 feet, with a ceiling high enough that she wouldn't have to duck. The floor was hard, packed dirt, and, along the walls, preserved by the cool, dry air, were the remnants of a life interrupted. A wooden chair, its legs still solid, a small table, a lantern that might still hold oil, and directly in front of her, placed as if waiting to be found, a tin box about the size of a bread loaf. Trudy stepped inside. The temperature dropped 10 degrees instantly. The flashlight beam cut through dusty air, illuminating details, scratches on the walls, marks that might have been tallies or dates. A blanket folded neatly on the chair, a cup sitting on the table. Someone had spent time down here, not just hidden things here, but actually stayed here. She moved to the tin box and knelt beside it. The metal was pitted with age, but intact. There was no lock, just a simple clasp that opened with a soft click. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that crinkled at her touch, were photographs. Trudy lifted them carefully into the flashlight beam. The first showed a young woman in a high-necked dress, her dark hair piled on her head in the style of the early 1900s. She stood beside a stone house, this house, with a serious expression, but it was her eyes that caught Trudy's attention. They were familiar in a way that made her chest tight. She'd seen those eyes in the mirror her whole life. The woman was her grandmother, decades before Trudy had known her. The second photograph showed 5 women standing together in what looked like a formal portrait. All wore similar high-neck dresses, all held the same serious expressions, and all wore identical silver brooches pinned at their throats. Trudy looked closer. Her grandmother was second from the left, and she looked younger here than in the first photograph, maybe 19 or 20. Who were these other women? Beneath the photographs were letters, their paper yellowed but the ink still legible. Trudy unfolded one carefully. "My dearest Jay," it began. "The nights grow longer and colder, but your warmth remains in my memory. When you return from the timber camps, I will be waiting. Your loving wife." Trudy's hand shook slightly. Her grandmother had been married before, to someone named Jay. She'd never heard this. Not once in all the family stories, all the quiet conversations she'd overheard as a child. Her grandmother had married her grandfather, everyone knew that. They'd lived in this valley their whole lives, raised children, grown old together. But there had been someone before, someone who went to timber camps and came home to letters like this. Trudy opened another letter, then another. All were signed the same way, "Your loving wife," but none bore a name. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in a separate piece of cloth, was a locket. Silver, tarnished black in places, with a delicate chain. Trudy opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a photograph of a young man. He wore a heavy coat and held an axe, standing in front of massive trees. His face was handsome in a rough way, all sharp angles and serious eyes. He looked like someone who worked with his hands and didn't smile much. This was Jay. It had to be. So where was he? Why had her grandmother married someone else? What had happened to this first husband, that the family never spoke of him? Trudy sat back on her heels, her mind racing. The cellar suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. She'd come looking for answers and found a dozen new questions. She gathered the photographs, letters, and locket carefully back into the tin box and stood. The flashlight beam swept across the walls again, and this time she noticed more details. The tally marks she'd seen before she counted them now, 43, as if someone had marked days spent down here. And near the back wall, scratched into the stone in letters that must have taken hours to carve, "God, forgive me." Trudy felt cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. She needed help. She needed someone who knew the valley's history, who could help her understand what she was looking at. Someone who had access to old records and newspapers and the kind of documentation that might explain who Jay was and what had happened to him. She needed Emmett. The thought made her uncomfortable. She'd spent 30 years not needing anyone, not asking for help, not opening herself up to the complications that came with letting people into your life. But this was bigger than her comfort. This was her family's history, her grandmother's secret. And if she was going to understand it, she couldn't do it alone. Trudy climbed out of the cellar and stood blinking in the daylight. The morning had passed while she'd worked on the door. It was afternoon now, the sun high and warm on her face. She carried the tin box to her truck and set it carefully on the passenger seat. Then she stood for a moment, hands on the truck's hood, breathing deeply. Everything she'd believed about her family had just shifted. Her grandmother hadn't been the simple homesteader's wife Trudy had known. She'd had another life, another love, another story that ended in a way serious enough to seal away in a cellar and never speak of again. What else had been hidden? What else had the family chosen to forget? Trudy climbed into the truck and started the engine. The drive to town took 20 minutes on the dirt road that led from the homestead to the county highway. 20 minutes to decide what she was going to say to Emmett after 30 years of silence. In the end, she didn't plan anything. She just drove to the Historical Society, parked in front, and walked in with the tin box under her arm. Emmett was at a desk near the back, bent over a large book of what looked like old property records. He looked up when the door chimed, and his expression shifted through surprise, caution, and something that might have been hope. "Trudy," he said, standing, "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." "I need your help," she said. "No preamble, no small talk, just the truth. I found something at the old homestead, something that doesn't make sense, and I think you're the only person who might be able to help me understand it." Emmett's expression softened. "Of course," he said. "Show me what you found." Trudy set the tin box on the desk between them and opened it, and just like that, after 30 years of running, she let someone back in. Emmett handled the photographs the way Trudy imagined he handled all historical documents, with reverence and care, as if they were sacred texts instead of faded images. He set each one on the desk in a careful row, then pulled a magnifying glass from a drawer to examine the details. "This is remarkable," he said quietly. "These are in extraordinary condition for their age. The cellar must have protected them perfectly." He looked up at her. "You said this was your grandmother?" Trudy nodded. "Second, from the left in that group portrait, Emmett studied the photograph of 5 women. These dresses date it to around 1904, maybe 1905. And these brooches," he leaned closer, "they're all identical. That's significant. This looks like a formal portrait." the kind people took to commemorate membership in an organization. What kind of organization? That's what we need to find out. He moved to the letters next, reading them quickly but carefully. These are love letters, and they reference someone working in timber camps, which was common in this valley during that era. We had 3 major logging operations between 1900 and 1915. But who was Jay? Trudy asked. I never heard my grandmother was married before my grandfather. Emmett opened the locket and examined the photograph inside. I don't recognize him, but that doesn't mean much. If he worked timber camps, he might not have been from here originally. A lot of those men were drifters, moving from one operation to another. He set the locket down and looked at Trudy directly. This is going to require real research. Property records, marriage certificates, census data. If your grandmother was married before, there should be documentation. May I ask, what was your grandmother's maiden name? Trudy realized she wasn't certain. I think it was Halvern, same as my grandfather's. They were distant cousins, I thought. Cousins marrying wasn't uncommon in remote areas, Emmett said. But if she was married before, she would have taken that husband's surname first. He made a note on a pad of paper. What was your grandmother's first name? Anne Halvern. Emmett nodded and added it to his notes. When did she die? I was 9, so that would have been 1972. And she would have been how old? Trudy did the math. 87. She was born in 1885, I think. Emmett wrote it all down. This gives us a starting point. If she was born in 1885 and these photographs were taken around 1904, she would have been about 19, a reasonable age for marriage in that era. He tapped the photograph of the 5 women. But I'm most interested in this. Matching brooches, formal portrait. This suggests an organized group, maybe a women's club or charitable organization. In 1904, Trudy was skeptical. Out here? You'd be surprised. Even frontier towns had social structures. Women formed aid societies, reading clubs, church groups. This valley had more culture than people assume. He stood and moved to a filing cabinet. Let me check our newspaper archives. If there was a formal women's organization in the early 1900s, it might have been mentioned in social announcements. While Emmett searched, Trudy walked around the room. The Historical Society occupied what had once been a bank building, and the old vault now stored their most valuable documents. The main room had display cases showing artifacts from the valley's past, mining equipment, homesteader tools, photographs of the town in its early days. She paused at a display of women's clothing from the early 1900s. The high-necked dress on the mannequin was remarkably similar to what her grandmother wore in the photographs. It made the past feel suddenly close, as if that young woman could walk into the room and Trudy would recognize her. I'm not finding anything in the social pages, Emmett said, frustration creeping into his voice. There are mentions of church socials and town dances, but no women's organizations with formal membership. He closed the bound volume of newspapers and looked at her. These women were organized about something, but they kept it quiet. Why would they do that? That's the question, isn't it? Emmett returned to the desk and studied the group portrait again. 5 women, all young, all wearing these identical symbols of membership. Something bound them together, but they didn't advertise it. He looked up at Trudy. Whatever this was, they wanted it private. A thought occurred to Trudy. You said these photographs were in extraordinary condition. Yes, the cellar. But why were they in the cellar at all? Trudy interrupted. If these were just family photographs, they would have been kept in the house, in albums or frames. But someone hid these away, sealed them up behind a brick wall for 120 years. Emmett set the magnifying glass down slowly. You're right, these aren't just memories someone wanted to preserve. These are secrets someone wanted to hide. The word hung between them. Secrets. the same word her grandfather had used in his journal. "There's more," Trudy said. She told him about the tally marks on the cellar wall, about the words scratched into the stone. "God forgive me," she repeated. "What would make someone write that?" Emmett was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "Trudy, I need to ask you something. Are you sure you want to keep digging into this? Sometimes families have secrets for good reasons. Sometimes the past is better left." "Don't," she said sharply. "Don't tell me. To leave it alone. My grandfather wanted me to find this. He left me the key and the map and a journal full of hints. He wanted me to know the truth. Even if the truth is painful, especially then." Trudy picked up the locket and held it in her palm. "This man existed. My grandmother loved him. Something happened that made her seal his memory away in a cellar and never speak of him again. That's not nothing. That's not something I can just ignore." Emmett nodded slowly. "All right. Then we keep looking." He pulled out a large ledger book. "This is the town registry from 1900 to 1910. Every birth, marriage, death, and property transfer was recorded here. If your grandmother married someone before your grandfather, it should be in here." They bent over the book together, and Trudy was suddenly aware of how close they were standing. Close enough that she could smell his soap, something clean and simple, close enough to feel the warmth of him beside her. It had been 30 years since she'd been this close to anyone. She forced her attention back to the registry, scanning the handwritten entries for her grandmother's name. And there, on a page dated June 1903, she found it. Marriage, Anne Whitfield to J. Samuel Whitfield, the 14th of June 1903. Trudy's breath caught. Whitfield. Her name was Whitfield. Emmett was already flipping forward through the pages. If they married in 1903 and she remarried your grandfather, then J. Samuel Whitfield must have died. He reached the death records and ran his finger down the entries. There, January 1905. J. Samuel Whitfield. Died the 12th of January 1905, age 29. Cause of death, accident. They looked at each other. 2 years, Trudy said. They were married for 2 years, and then he died in an accident. And less than 6 months later, Emmett said, still reading the registry, your grandmother married your grandfather, the 3rd of May, 1905, Anne Whitfield to Ernest Halvern. Quick remarriage wasn't unusual for that era. Life was hard, and widows needed protection and support. But something about the timeline felt wrong to Trudy. The sealed cellar, the hidden photographs, the words scratched in stone. This wasn't just a tragic accident and a widow moving on. This was something else entirely. Trudy couldn't sleep that night. She'd taken a room at the small motel on the edge of town, 6 units in a row, each one identical, each one smelling faintly of pine cleaner and old carpet. She lay on the bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, her mind circling the same questions over and over. Who was J. Samuel Whitfield? How did he die? Why did her grandmother seal away every trace of him? At 2 in the morning she gave up on sleep and pulled out her grandfather's journal. She'd read it a dozen times already, but now she was looking for something specific. Any mention of the name Whitfield. Any hint about what happened in January 1905. Most of the entries were mundane. Notes about weather, about crops and livestock, about neighbors and town events. But scattered throughout were stranger passages, cryptic references that made more sense now that she knew about J. Samuel Whitfield. The past can't be undone, only accepted, her grandfather had written in an entry dated 1947. Anne still wakes sometimes from dreams of that winter. I hold her and tell her it's over, it's done, we're safe. But I know she sees him in those dreams. I know she remembers. And another entry from 1963, Trudy asked today why we don't have family photographs from before the war. I told her they were lost in a move. The lie came easy after so many years. But Anne looked at me across the table and I saw the weight of it in her eyes. All these years carrying the truth alone, even from our children, especially from our children. Trudy set the journal down and rubbed her eyes. Her grandfather had known. Of course he'd known. He'd been there, had married Anne just months after Whitfield died. He'd helped her keep the secret. But what was the secret? She picked up the journal again and turned to the back cover. The map was still taped there, showing the 3 X marks, one at the cellar which she'd found, 2 others on the property. She'd been so focused on the cellar that she'd forgotten about the other locations. The next morning, Trudy drove back to the homestead with a shovel and metal detector borrowed from Emmett. He'd offered to come with her, but she'd declined. She needed to do this part alone, to walk the property and think without the distraction of conversation. The first X mark was near the old barn foundation, about 100 yards from the house. Trudy swept the metal detector over the area, listening for the telltale beep that would indicate something buried below. After an hour of searching, she found it. Not buried deep, just 18 inches down. A rusted metal box about the size of a shoebox. Inside were farm tools, a hammer, some nails, a broken saw blade. Nothing that explained anything. Disappointed, Trudy moved to the second location, marked near the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property. This was harder terrain, all rocks and tree roots, and it took her most of the afternoon to search it properly. But when the metal detector finally beeped, it was strong and insistent. She started digging. 3 feet down, her shovel hit something solid, not metal this time, wood. She dug more carefully, exposing the top of a wooden box about 2 feet long and a foot wide. The wood was rotted in places, but still intact. Trudy lifted it out of the hole and set it on the ground. Her hands were shaking. Inside was a leather document case, protected from moisture by the wooden box. And inside the case were papers. A marriage certificate for Anne Whitfield and J. Samuel Whitfield, dated the 14th of June, 1903. She'd already seen that recorded in the town registry, but holding the actual document made it real in a way the registry entry hadn't. A. Property deed, transferring ownership of the homestead from J. Samuel Whitfield to Ernest Halvern, dated February 1905. Just 1 month after Whitfield's death, and a birth certificate dated the 3rd of March 1904, baby girl, born to Anne Whitfield. Father, J. Samuel Whitfield. No name listed for the child. Just baby girl. Trudy sat back hard, the paper trembling in her hands. Her grandmother had given birth to a daughter, a child who would have been less than a year old when J. Samuel Whitfield died, but Trudy had never heard of this child. Her grandmother had raised 3 children with Ernest Halvern, and none of them had ever mentioned an older sibling. What happened to the baby? She searched through the remaining papers frantically, looking for a death certificate, a burial record, anything. But there was nothing else in the box. She pulled out her phone to call Emmett, then realized she had no signal out here. She'd have to drive to town. But first, she sat beside the creek and let herself cry. She'd come looking for answers about her grandmother's first marriage, expecting to find a simple story of young love and tragic loss. Instead, she'd found layers of secrets, each one deeper than the last. A first husband nobody spoke of, a daughter who disappeared from all records, a property transfer that happened suspiciously fast after a man's death, and a grandfather who knew it all and carried it to his grave. When she could breathe normally again, Trudy packed up the documents and drove to town. Emmett was still at the Historical Society, working late as he apparently always did. He took one look at her face and came around the desk immediately. What happened? She handed him the birth certificate without a word. He read it, and his expression shifted to understanding. A child, a daughter, born in 1904, which means she was less than a year old when Whitfield died. but I've never heard of her. My mother never mentioned an older aunt. There's no death certificate in the box, no record of what happened to her. Emmett set the certificate down carefully. Infant mortality was high in that era, especially in remote areas with limited medical care. It's possible. Don't. Trudy's voice was sharp. Don't tell me what's possible. I need to know what actually happened. He nodded. Then we look for death records. County records might have more detail than what was reported in town. There's something else, Trudy said. She pulled out the property deed. The homestead transferred from Whitfield to my grandfather 1 month after Whitfield died. Not to my grandmother, to Ernest Halvern. Why would that be? Emmett studied the deed. Women could inherit property in Montana in 1905, so it's strange that it went directly to a man who wasn't the husband. He looked up at her. Unless Ernest Halvern bought it from your grandmother. With what money? He was a land agent, not a wealthy man. Then maybe it was a gift, or payment, for something. The words hung between them, uncomfortable and loaded with implication. Trudy, Emmett said carefully, I think we need to go to the county records office. There's more to this story, and the pieces are scattered across multiple sources. If we're going to understand what really happened, we need to see everything. She knew he was right, but she also knew that once they started down this path, there would be no turning back. Whatever her grandmother had hidden, whatever her grandfather had protected, it was about to come into the light, and Trudy wasn't sure she was ready for what they'd find. But she nodded anyway. When can we go? Tomorrow, Emmett said. The county seat is 2 hours away. We should leave early. We? Trudy asked. Emmett looked at her steadily. You asked for my help. I'm giving it. Unless you'd rather go alone. She should say yes. She should maintain her independence, her self-reliance, her careful distance from other people. But she was tired. Tired of being alone. Tired of carrying everything by herself. Tired of running. Tomorrow morning, she agreed. Early. That night, back at the motel, Trudy did something she hadn't done in 30 years. She called someone just to talk. Emmett answered on the second ring. Is everything all right? I don't know, she said honestly. I keep thinking about that baby. About what might have happened to her. About my grandmother carrying that grief and never speaking of it. It's a heavy thing to discover, Emmett said quietly. My daughter died when she was 3, Trudy said. The words came out before she could stop them. Pneumonia. One day she was fine, the next day she was gone, and I ran. I left everything and everyone and built a life where I'd never have to feel that pain again. There was a pause. Then Emmett said, I know. I understood then, and I understand now. I'm sorry, Trudy said. I'm sorry I left the way I did. I'm sorry I never explained. You don't have to apologize. Grief doesn't follow rules. Trudy closed her eyes. Did you ever marry? No, Emmett said. Came close once, but it didn't work out. I think I was looking for something that wasn't there anymore. A pause. What about you? No, I don't think I could have. I don't think I've had room in my life for anyone else. And now, his voice was gentle, careful. Now I'm not sure what I have room for, Trudy admitted. But I'm glad you're helping me with this. I'm glad I don't have to do it alone. You never had to, Emmett said. But I'm glad you're letting me help now. They talked for another hour, about small things and large ones, about the years that had passed and the people they'd become. And when Trudy finally hung up and turned off the light, she slept better than she had in weeks. The drive to the county seat took them through mountain passes, still patched with snow despite the late spring warmth. Trudy gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, her knuckles white. She hadn't driven on highways in years, hadn't dealt with traffic or road construction, or the simple chaos of other people going places. Emmett sat in the passenger seat with the folder of documents on his lap, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing bits of valley history. He was giving her something to focus on besides her nerves, and she appreciated it more than she could say. The county records building was a stolid brick structure that had probably looked official and imposing when it was built in the 1922. Now, it just looked tired, like everything else in the small city that served as the county seat. Inside, a woman with grey hair and reading glasses on a chain directed them to the archives in the basement. Death records from 1900 to 1920 are in Section C, she said. Marriage and property records are in Section A. Birth records are restricted, but the pre-1920 ones are accessible with proper ID. The basement smelled like old paper and mildew. Rows of filing cabinets and bound ledgers stretched into dimness, lit by flickering fluorescent tubes. It was exactly the kind of place Emmett loved and Trudy found suffocating. They started with death records, looking for any mention of a baby girl dying in 1904 or 1905. The ledgers were handwritten, organized by date, with varying levels of detail depending on who'd done the recording. January 1905 had only 3 deaths recorded. 2 were elderly men, 1 from natural causes and 1 from a fall. The third was J. Samuel Whitfield. Trudy read the entry twice. Accidental death. No further details. That's unusual, Emmett said, looking over her shoulder. Accidental deaths typically included some description. Fall from height, logging accident, drowning, they'd note what kind of accident. So why doesn't this? I don't know. But look at this. He pointed to a notation in the margin, almost too faint to read. Investigation closed. No further inquiry. There was an investigation. Apparently, which means his death was suspicious enough that someone looked into it. But then they closed the case without recording what they found. Trudy felt cold spreading through her chest. Someone covered something up. Maybe. Or maybe it was just handled informally. Small towns in that era sometimes dealt with things their own way, especially if the death involved people they knew. They searched for another hour, but found no death record for a baby girl. No burial record, no notation of an infant dying in the Whitfield household. She could have died somewhere else, Emmett suggested. If Anne took her to family in another county, or if the baby was given to someone else to raise. Given away. Trudy stared at him. You think my grandmother gave away her daughter? I'm saying it's possible. Single motherhood after a husband's death was difficult. If Ernest Halvern was willing to marry her but not raise another man's child, she might have had to make a hard choice. The thought made Trudy sick, but she couldn't deny it was possible. They moved to newspaper archives next. The county library kept bound volumes of the local paper going back to its founding in 1892. They found the January 1905 editions and spread them across a reading table. The edition dated the 15th of January 1905 had a brief mention on page 3. Local man dies in winter accident. J. Samuel Whitfield, employed at the Pinecrest lumber operation, died on January 12 during a winter storm. He leaves behind a wife. Services will be private. That was all. No details about the accident, no description of what happened, no quotes from family or friends. For a death in a small community, it was remarkably sparse. They didn't want people asking questions, Trudy said. Emmett nodded slowly. It looks that way. They kept searching, going through papers from the months before and after Whitfield's death. In the November 1904 edition, they found a social announcement about a church social where Mrs. J.S. Whitfield contributed preserves. In December, there was a mention of the Whitfield household hosting a small gathering. Normal life, normal mentions of a young couple in the community, and then, after January, nothing. Anne Whitfield disappeared from the social pages entirely until May, when her marriage to Ernest Halvern was announced. She went into hiding, Trudy said. For 4 months after her husband died, she was invisible. Or in mourning. That was expected for widows. But then, why the rushed remarriage? Why marry again so quickly if she was properly observing mourning customs? Emmett didn't have an answer for that. They spent another hour searching through property records, confirming what they already knew. The homestead had belonged to J. Samuel Whitfield, purchased in 1903 shortly after his marriage. Upon his death, it transferred to Ernest Halvern. The mechanism of transfer wasn't clear, no sale price was listed, no mortgage noted. It's like it just changed hands, Trudy said. Like Whitfield dying made it automatically become my grandfather's property. Which suggests Ernest Halvern had some claim to it even before the marriage. Family connection, perhaps. Or debt. On their way out of the records building, Trudy stopped at the front desk. Is there any way to access old sheriff's reports from 1905? The woman looked up from her computer. Those would be in the sheriff's historical archives, but they're not open to the public. You'd need a specific reason to request access. What counts as a specific reason? Legal case, academic research with institutional backing, direct family connection to a criminal investigation. She peered at Trudy over her reading glasses. Why? What are you looking for? A death investigation for my great-grandfather, Trudy said, bending the truth only slightly. It was ruled accidental, but there's almost no information about what happened. The woman's expression softened. I understand, honey, but unless you can prove there's an active legal need, I can't help you. Those files are sealed by default to protect privacy. Outside, standing beside Trudy's truck in the parking lot, Emmett said, there's something else we can try. The Historical Society has contacts at other institutions. I might be able to request access to those sheriff's reports for academic purposes. Would you do that? Of course. This is exactly the kind of local history that deserves to be understood and preserved. He paused. But Trudy, I have to ask, what are you hoping to find? What outcome would make this worth it? She was quiet for a long moment, watching clouds build over the mountains. I want to understand why my grandmother had to hide so much, why my grandfather helped her hide it. What happened that was so terrible it had to be sealed away for 120 years? And if the answer is something you wish you didn't know, then at least I'll know, Trudy said. At least I'll understand why I spent my whole life feeling like there was something wrong, something missing, some truth that nobody would speak. The drive back to Ironwood Valley was quieter. Trudy's mind was full of fragments, birth certificates and death records, newspaper articles and property deeds. Pieces of a story that didn't quite fit together yet. Emmett dozed in the passenger seat, his head against the window. In sleep, his face relaxed, and Trudy could see the young man she'd known 30 years ago. The one who'd wanted to marry her, build a life with her, weather whatever storms came. She'd run from him because she couldn't bear the thought of losing someone else she loved. But maybe running was its own kind of loss. 2 days later, Trudy was back at the homestead, searching the cellar more thoroughly than before. She'd brought proper lighting this time. A battery-powered lantern that filled the space with clear white light, and she was examining every inch of the walls and floor. The tally marks were definitely days. 43 of them scratched into the stone near the back wall. Someone had spent 43 days down here. The thought made Trudy's skin crawl. She ran her hands along the stone, feeling for any irregularities, any places that might hide something else. Her fingers caught on a loose stone about waist-high on the east wall. She worked it carefully, wiggling it back and forth until it came free. Behind it was a small cavity, and inside the cavity, wrapped in oilcloth, was a silver brooch. Trudy pulled it out into the light. It was identical to the ones in the photograph, the same design, the same size. But this one she could examine up close, turning it over in her hands. On the back was an engraving, fine script that she had to squint to read. Silent Sisters, bound by covenant. Silent Sisters. The phrase sent a chill through her. She pocketed the brooch and continued, searching, but found nothing else. When she emerged from the cellar an hour later, squinting in the bright afternoon sun, she found someone waiting for her. An elderly woman sat on the stone steps leading to the house's front door. She wore a floral dress and sensible shoes, her white hair pinned up in a style that belonged to a different era. She had to be close to 90, but her eyes were sharp and clear. "You're Anne's granddaughter," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "I am. Trudy Halvern. I'm Opal Jennings. My grandmother knew your grandmother. Knew her well." She patted the step beside her. "Sit with me a moment, if you would." Trudy sat, wary but curious. "I heard you've been asking questions," Opal said, digging into old history. "Thought you should know what you're really looking for before you find something you can't unknow." "What am I looking for?" Opal pulled a folded handkerchief from her pocket and dabbed at her forehead. The day was warm, and the walk, from wherever she'd come from, had apparently tired her. "My grandmother left some things when she passed. Letters, a diary. I've kept them all these years, never quite sure what to do with them. But when I heard Anne's granddaughter was back, searching that old cellar, I thought maybe it was time." She pulled a small book from her purse. The leather was cracked with age, the pages yellowed. "This was my grandmother's diary. She was one of the 5 women in that photograph you found. Her name was Iris Whitfield J., Samuel's sister." Trudy took the diary with shaking hands. "You should read it," Opal said. "But not here. Take it home. Take your time. When you're done, if you have questions, you come find me. I live at the Valley Rest Home in town, room 14. "Why are you giving this to me?" Opal stood slowly, using the stone railing to steady herself. "Because my grandmother wanted the truth known, but only when it was safe. She made me promise not to speak of it while anyone who'd been hurt by it was still living. But they're all gone now. Your grandmother, your grandfather, all the others. There's nobody left to protect." She looked at Trudy with eyes that had seen a long life. "Except maybe you. You deserve to know what Anne survived, what she built from the ashes." She walked away before Trudy could ask anything else, moving slowly but steadily down the dirt road toward town. Trudy sat on the steps for a long time, holding the diary, not quite ready to open it. When she finally did, sitting at the small table in her motel room that evening, the first entry took her breath away. June 1904. "We formed our covenant today. 5 of us who understand what it means to be trapped, to be owned, to have no voice and no choice. We call ourselves the Silent Sisters because we cannot speak our truths aloud. But among ourselves we pledge this: we will protect each other, we will help each other survive. We will do whatever is necessary to free ourselves and our sisters from the men who hurt us. We bound ourselves with silver brooches, tokens of our oath. May God have mercy on us for what we may have to do." Trudy read through the night, unable to stop. The diary told a story of 5 young women in the Bitterroot Valley, all married to violent men. In an era when divorce was nearly impossible and the law offered women no protection from their husbands, they'd formed a secret network. They helped each other hide money. They provided safe houses when a sister needed to escape a beating. They created coded signals to check on each other's safety. And when violence escalated beyond bearing, they helped each other disappear. Iris wrote about her brother Jay, Samuel, with a mixture of love and disgust. "He is my blood, but I cannot defend what he's become. The drink has made him cruel, and Anne bears the brunt of it. I see the bruises she tries to hide. I hear the fear in her voice when she speaks of him." Later, entries were more desperate. "Anne's baby is due any day. She's terrified of what will happen when Samuel drinks and the baby cries. He has no patience for noise, for need, for anything that isn't his own comfort. I fear for both of them." And then, November 1904, the baby died. Samuel beat Anne for letting it cry, and in the struggle, the child fell. Anne says it was an accident, but I see the truth in her eyes. Samuel killed that baby as surely as if he'd put hands around its throat. We buried the girl in the woods. No marker, no record. Anne wanted no evidence of what happened, no reminder. I think it broke something in her that will never heal. Trudy had to stop reading. She went to the bathroom and vomited, then sat on the floor with her back against the tub, shaking. Her grandmother's baby hadn't died of natural causes. She'd been killed by her own father in a drunken rage, and the family had hidden it, buried the child in the woods somewhere, no grave marker, no record, as if she'd never existed. When Trudy could breathe normally again, she returned to the diary. The final entries, from January 1905, told the rest of the story. Samuel discovered Anne's plan to leave. He locked her in the cellar, said he'd deal with her when he sobered up. But the sisters got word. We all came in the blizzard, myself, Anne's cousins, Mary and Ruth, and our allies, Margaret and Lily. We found Samuel drunk and raging, threatening to kill Anne when he let her out. Ernest Halvern was with us. He'd been helping the sisters for months, providing legal documents, using his position as land agent to help women establish new identities. He loved Anne. We all knew it. When Samuel came at us with an axe, Ernest didn't hesitate. He killed Samuel with his own tool, one clean blow. We made it look like an accident in the storm. The sheriff suspected, but he was married to Margaret. He understood what we were doing and why. He closed the investigation. Ernest married Anne to legitimize the property transfer and protect her. They built a good life from terrible beginnings. God forgive us all. Trudy closed the diary and sat in the dark motel room until dawn. Trudy didn't go to Emmett immediately. She spent the day walking the mountains above town, trying to process what she'd learned. Her grandmother had been a victim of horrific violence. Her first child had been killed by a drunk, abusive husband. And when that husband threatened her life, her friends and her future second husband had killed him. But it was still homicide, and everyone involved had conspired to hide it for 120 years. She returned to the homestead as the sun was setting, golden light streaming across the valley. She stood in front of the cellar door, still open after all these years of being sealed, and tried to imagine her grandmother down there. Locked in the dark, knowing her husband planned to kill her when he sobered up, waiting for rescue or death. 43 days of tally marks. Had her grandmother been counting the days since her baby died? The days until she could escape? The days of her imprisonment? Trudy climbed down into the cellar one more time. With Iris's diary fresh in her mind, the space felt different. Not just a storage room or a hiding place, but a prison cell. A place of desperation and fear. She moved to the back wall where the tally marks were scratched, ran her fingers over them, feeling the effort it would have taken to carve stone with nothing but determination and something sharp. And then she noticed something she'd missed before. The floor stones directly beneath the tally marks were slightly different in color, darker, as if they'd been disturbed and replaced. She knelt and examined them more closely. The mortar around 3 stones was newer than the rest, not by much, maybe only a few decades old instead of a century. Someone had lifted these stones and reset them. Her grandfather, it had to be. He'd been the one maintaining the property over the years, and he'd left the map showing where things were hidden. Trudy used a screwdriver from her truck to pry at the mortar. It crumbled more easily than it should have. Within 15 minutes, she had the first stone lifted. Beneath it was another oilcloth-wrapped package. She pulled it out and carried it up into the fading daylight. Inside was a journal, not her grandfather's. The handwriting was different, more delicate. She opened to the first page and read, "If you're reading this, your family, and you deserve the truth. I am Anne Whitfield Halvern, and this is my confession." Trudy's hands shook as she turned the pages. Her grandmother's account began with her marriage to J. Samuel Whitfield in 1903. She'd been 19, he'd been 26. He was handsome and charming when he courted me, Anne wrote. I didn't see the darkness in him until after the wedding. Or perhaps I saw it and didn't understand what it meant. The abuse had started small, harsh words, unreasonable demands, but it escalated quickly. By the time Anne realized her mistake, she was pregnant and trapped. I loved my daughter from the moment I felt her move inside me. I prayed she would be a boy, thinking Samuel might be kinder to a son. But she was a girl, and from the day she was born, he resented her. Every cry annoyed him, every need was an imposition. I tried to keep her quiet, tried to be perfect, tried to shield her from his anger. But it was never enough. The baby had lived 7 months. 7 months of Anne trying desperately to protect her from an increasingly violent father. The 3rd of November 1904. The day my world ended. Samuel came home drunk, as he often did. The baby was crying because she was hungry, and I was trying to heat milk on the stove. He told me to shut her up. I was holding her, trying to soothe her, when he grabbed my arm. I stumbled. The baby fell. Anne described the horrible moments after the sudden silence, the terrible stillness of her daughter's small body. Samuel said it was my fault for being clumsy, but I had been holding her securely until he grabbed me. He killed her, though he'd never admit it, and I knew then that I would be next if I didn't find a way out. That's when the Silent Sisters had become her salvation. Iris Whitfield, Samuel's own sister, had approached Anne after the baby's funeral. She told me there were other women like me, women who understood, women who would help. I didn't know what that meant until later, until I understood the full extent of what they were willing to do. The plan had been for Anne to disappear. They'd forged documents establishing a new identity in a different county. Ernest Halvern, who'd loved Anne since they were children, had arranged for property and a fresh start. But Samuel had discovered the plan. He found my packed bag, found the papers Iris had given me. He flew into a rage worse than any I'd seen before. He dragged me to the cellar and locked me in. Said I'd stay there until I learned my place. Said when he let me out, he'd teach me a lesson I'd never forget. I knew he meant to kill me. Anne had been in the cellar for 3 days when the Silent Sisters came. It was January 12, during a blizzard. I heard voices above arguing, shouting. Then Samuel's roar of anger. I screamed for help, pounding on the door. I heard Ernest's voice, heard him demanding, "Samuel, let me out." Then a terrible crash and silence. When they'd finally opened the cellar door, Samuel was dead in the snow and Ernest was standing over him with an axe. I should have felt horror. Instead, I felt relief. He was gone. The monster who'd killed my baby and beaten me for a year was gone, and I was free. But freedom came with a price. We made a choice that night, all of us. We chose to protect each other rather than trust the law. We chose survival over truth. Ernest hit Samuel's body with the axe a few more times, making it look like an accident, like he'd been chopping wood in the storm and slipped. We scattered wood and tools around him, made it look reasonable. The sheriff came, asked questions, but Margaret was his wife and she vouched for all of us. He ruled it accidental and closed the case. Anne had married Ernest 3 months later. It was practical at first. He could legitimize the property transfer, protect me from Samuel's relatives who might question things. But over time, it became real. Ernest was good to me, patient and kind. He never pushed, never demanded. He gave me time to heal, and eventually, I loved him. Not the desperate, consuming love I'd felt for Samuel in the beginning, but something steadier, safer, better. They'd had 3 children together, built a good life, became pillars of the community. But I never forgot what we did. Never forgot Samuel lying in the snow, or my baby girl buried in the woods with no marker, or the 3 days I spent locked in darkness, waiting to die. Some nights I still wake from dreams of the cellar, and Ernest holds me and tells me I'm safe. He knows, he's always known. He carries the weight of it too. The journal's final entry was dated June 1970, 2 years before Anne died. I'm leaving this account hidden beneath the cellar floor. Ernest knows where it is. If someone finds it someday, if the truth comes out, I want them to understand. We weren't criminals. We were survivors. We did what the law wouldn't do. We protected the innocent from the violent. I'd do it all again. Every hard choice, every hidden truth, every quiet year of building something good from something terrible, I'd do it all again to be free. Trudy closed the journal and looked up at the darkening sky. Tears ran down her face, but she wasn't sure what emotion they represented. Grief for her grandmother's suffering? Relief that the truth was finally known? Anger at a world that had forced women to take such desperate measures? All of it, maybe. Or something beyond naming. Her grandmother hadn't been a killer. She'd been a victim who'd been saved by people brave enough to break the law for the sake of justice. And her grandfather hadn't been a murderer. He'd been a hero who'd loved a woman enough to risk everything to save her. The truth was more complicated than Trudy had imagined, more painful and more beautiful at the same time. She gathered the journal carefully and stood. It was time to show Emmett what she'd found. It was time to decide what to do with the truth. Trudy met Emmett at the Historical Society that evening. She handed him Anne's journal without preamble. "Read it. All of it." She watched his face as he read, saw the emotions move across his features, shock, sorrow, understanding, and finally a kind of resigned sadness. When he finished, he set the journal down carefully and removed his glasses to rub his eyes. "This is remarkable and terrible, and exactly what I suspected once we started finding the pieces. It's a confession to murder," Trudy said bluntly. "It's a confession to justified homicide in defense of another person," Emmett corrected. "There's a difference, even if the law might not have seen it that way in 1905. What do we do with it?" "That depends. What do you want to do?" Before Trudy could answer, the phone on Emmett's desk rang. He answered it, listened for a moment, and his expression darkened. "I see. Yes, she's here with me now. We'll come by in the morning." He hung up and looked at Trudy. "That was the town clerk. You've received legal notice of a property dispute." "What?" "Someone is challenging your ownership of the homestead. They're claiming the 1,905 property transfer from J. Samuel Whitfield to Ernest Halvern was fraudulent." Trudy felt the floor shift beneath her. "Who?" "A man named Marcus Whitfield. He's a descendant of Samuel's brother. Apparently he's been researching his family history and found irregularities in the property records from 1,905. He's filed a formal challenge with the county, claiming the transfer should be voided and the property should revert to the Whitfield family, specifically to him. The timing couldn't be worse, or maybe it was perfect, in a horrible way. Trudy had just discovered the full truth about how her grandfather had acquired the property, and now someone was challenging that acquisition in court. Can he win? Emmett was quiet for a moment. Possibly. The transfer was irregular. No sale price listed, no clear chain of ownership beyond Ernest Halvern's signature on the deed. If Marcus can prove fraud or improper dealing, a court might void the transfer. But it was over 100 years ago. Property law doesn't really have a statute of limitations. If the original transfer was illegal, it's illegal regardless of how much time has passed. He looked at her seriously. "Trudy, if you want to fight this, you'll need to prove the transfer was legitimate, which means revealing the truth about how Samuel Whitfield really died." "Yes." Trudy sat down hard in one of the research chairs. Her mind was racing. If she revealed the truth that Samuel Whitfield had been killed by Ernest Halvern to protect Anne, she'd expose her grandparents as killers. Even if their actions were justified, even if they'd built a good life afterward, the revelation would destroy their reputation, would dishonor their memory. But if she didn't reveal the truth, she'd lose the homestead. And more than that, she'd lose the story of the Silent Sisters, the account of women who'd protected each other when the law wouldn't. She'd lose her grandmother's legacy of survival and courage. "There's a town meeting scheduled for next week," Emmett said, reading from the legal notice. "Marcus Whitfield wants to present his case publicly before filing formal court papers. It's not required, but it seems he wants community support." Smart, Trudy said, bitterly. Make it a public pressure campaign before making it a legal battle. Or he genuinely wants to understand the truth before proceeding. Either way, you'll have a chance to respond. Trudy stood and walked to the window. Outside, Main Street was quiet in the evening dusk. A few people walked past, heading home from the diner or the store. Simple lives in a simple town, none of them knowing what secrets their grandparents might have buried. I need to talk to Opal, Trudy said. She gave me Iris's diary. She knows the truth about the Silent Sisters. Maybe she'll stand with me. And if she will, then maybe I can honor my grandmother's courage instead of hiding it. The next morning, Trudy visited the Valley Rest home. The building was small but well-maintained, with a front porch where several elderly residents sat in the morning sun. One of them directed Trudy to room 14. Opal was sitting by her window, crocheting what looked like a blanket. She smiled when Trudy knocked. I wondered if you'd come. I read the diary. My grandmother's journal too. I know the truth now. And someone is trying to take the homestead, a Whitfield descendant. He's challenging the property transfer from 1905. Opal's hands stilled on her crochet work. Is he now? There's going to be a town meeting. He wants to make his case publicly. If I want to keep the property, I'll have to defend how my grandfather acquired it. Which means telling the truth about Samuel Whitfield and what he did. Opal nodded slowly. I always knew this day might come. Truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deep you bury it. Will you help me? Will you testify about the Silent Sisters, about what your grandmother wrote in her diary? I will. But you should know, child, that speaking this truth will change things. People in this valley have their own ideas about history, about the families who built this town. Learning that some of those founding families were built on violence and justified homicide that's going to shake people. I know, but the alternative is letting Marcus Whitfield claim property his ancestor forfeited through his own cruelty, and losing the story of women who protected each other when nobody else would. Opal set her crocheting aside and stood with some difficulty. She went to a small dresser and pulled out a wooden box. Inside were more papers, old photographs, and another silver brooch. This was my grandmother's. She wore it until she died, then passed it to me with instructions to keep it safe until the time was right to tell the story. She handed the brooch to Trudy. I think that time has come. Over the next few days, word spread through Ironwood Valley that there would be a town meeting about the old Halvern homestead. People were curious, property disputes were rare in such a small community, and anything involving the valley's history drew interest. Trudy spent the time preparing. She gathered all the documents: Anne's journal, Iris's diary, the birth and death certificates, the property deeds, the photographs. She made copies of everything, organized them chronologically, built a timeline that told the complete story. Emmett helped, using his historian skills to create a clear narrative from the scattered pieces. You'll need to be direct, he advised. Don't apologize for what happened. Don't frame it as a shameful secret. Frame it as a story of survival and justice in an era when women had no legal protection. 2 days before the meeting, Marcus Whitfield arrived in town. Trudy saw him at the general store, a man in his 50s, well-dressed in a way that marked him as from somewhere else. He was talking to the store owner about his research into the Whitfield family history, about how he'd discovered the property irregularities. He wasn't hostile. That was what struck Trudy. He seemed genuinely interested in understanding the truth, not just claiming property. She approached him directly. I'm Trudy Halvern. I think we need to talk. He turned, and she saw surprise, followed by wariness, cross his face. Mrs. Halvern, I was hoping to meet you before the town meeting. Then let's meet now. There are things you need to know about your ancestor. Things that aren't in the public records. They sat at a corner table in the general store's small cafe area. Trudy laid out the basic facts: Samuel Whitfield's violence, the death of her grandmother's baby, the abuse that had led to the events of January 1905. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I've been researching my family tree for 5 years, he finally said. Samuel Whitfield was always a blank spot. No descendants, died young, and almost no information beyond basic facts. I thought maybe I'd found a mystery to solve, a lost branch of the family to recover. And instead you found a violent drunk who beat his wife and killed his child. So it seems." He looked at her directly. "I'm not trying to dishonor your family, Mrs. Halvern. I'm trying to understand my own. If what you're telling me is true, and I have no reason to doubt you, then the property transfer makes more sense. But legally, it's still questionable. Your grandfather didn't buy the property. It was just transferred to him. Because he protected my grandmother from a man who was going to kill her," Trudy said. "The transfer was payment for saving her life, which, from a legal standpoint, could still be considered improper dealing." Trudy met his eyes. "Then I guess we'll let the town decide. At the meeting, I'm going to tell the whole story, my grandmother's account, the Silent Sister's role, everything. And then people can judge whether justice was served or whether fraud was committed." Marcus nodded slowly. "Fair enough. I'll be interested to hear it." The night before the town meeting, Trudy couldn't sleep. She lay in the motel bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about her grandmother, about the courage it had taken to survive what she'd survived, about the strength required to build a good life from such terrible beginnings, and about the fact that tomorrow Trudy would break 120 years of silence. She thought about calling Emmett, but it was late. Instead, she pulled out her grandmother's journal and read the final entry again. "I'd do it all again. Every hard choice, every hidden truth, every quiet year of building something good from something terrible. I'd do it all again to be free." Trudy understood now. Freedom wasn't just escaping violence. It was choosing to live fully despite the weight of the past. It was refusing to let secrets and shame define you. Her grandmother had been free because she'd survived and built something better, and tomorrow Trudy would honor that freedom by telling the truth. The town hall was packed, every chair filled, people standing along the walls, others gathered near the doorway trying to hear. Trudy had never seen so many people in one place in Ironwood Valley. Word of the meeting had spread through the community like wildfire, and apparently everyone wanted to witness history being made. Marcus Whitfield sat at a table at the front, his lawyer beside him, a professional woman from the city with a briefcase full of documents. They'd set up a presentation showing the property transfer records, highlighting the irregularities Marcus had discovered. Trudy sat at a table opposite them. Emmett was beside her, and Opal had insisted on sitting with her as well, making the journey from the rest home with the help of her walker. The three of them faced the crowd like defendants awaiting judgment. The mayor, a man named Bill Thornton who ran the hardware store when he wasn't managing town affairs, called the meeting to order. "This is an informal hearing," he said, "not a legal proceeding. Mr. Whitfield has requested the opportunity to present his case to the community before filing formal papers with the county court. Mrs. Halvern will have equal time to respond. We're here to listen and understand, not to render judgment. That's for the courts if this moves forward." Marcus stood and began his presentation. He was clear and organized, walking through his family tree research, showing how Samuel Whitfield had purchased the homestead in 1903 and how it had transferred to Ernest Halvern in 1905 without clear documentation of sale or inheritance. "The transfer appears to have been a gift or payment of some kind," Marcus said, "but there's no legal basis for it. Samuel Whitfield died without a will. By law, his property should have gone to his widow, and then, if she remarried, it should have remained hers. Instead, it went directly to Ernest Halvern, who married the widow 3 months later. The timeline is suspicious. The lack of documentation is problematic. And if this transfer was improper, then the subsequent transfers, including the one to Mrs. Halvern, are also invalid. His lawyer added technical details about property law and chain of title. It all sounded very official and very damning. When they finished, the room was quiet. Several people nodded, apparently convinced by the logical presentation. Then it was Trudy's turn. She stood slowly, her legs shaking. She'd never been good with crowds, with public speaking, with being the center of attention. But this was for her grandmother, for Anne and Iris and the other silent sisters, for all the women who'd had to hide their survival. "Mr. Whitfield is right about the irregularities," Trudy began. "The property transfer was unusual, but he doesn't know why. He doesn't know what really happened in January 1905, and without that context, the legal records don't tell the true story." She pulled out Anne's journal and held it up. "This is my grandmother's confession, written in her own hand, hidden beneath the cellar, the floor of the homestead for decades. She wanted the truth known, but only when it was safe, when everyone involved was gone and couldn't be hurt by it." Trudy began to read. She read about Samuel Whitfield's violence, about the baby who died, about Anne being locked in the cellar. She read about the silent sisters and their covenant to protect each other. The room was absolutely silent. People who'd been shifting in their seats or whispering to neighbors had gone still. She read about the night of the 12th of January 1905. About Ernest Halvern killing Samuel Whitfield to save Anne's life. Someone gasped. Others murmured, but most just listened. "My grandfather didn't steal the property," Trudy said, her voice steady now. "He earned it by saving my grandmother from a man who would have killed her. The transfer was payment for that act of courage. The sheriff knew the truth and chose not to prosecute because he understood that justice had already been served." She set the journal down and picked up Iris's diary. This belonged to Iris Whitfield, Samuel's own sister. She was one of the silent sisters. She witnessed her brother's violence and made the choice to protect his victim instead of defending her blood relative. Trudy read selected passages from Iris's account, letting the woman's own words describe the network of protection the sisters had built. When she finished, she looked directly at Marcus Whitfield. "Your ancestor was a violent man who beat his wife and killed his infant daughter. The women who protected Anne from him were heroes, not criminals. And Ernest Halvern, who struck the blow that ended Samuel's life, was defending someone who couldn't defend herself." She paused, letting it sink in. "So yes, the property transfer was irregular. Yes, it bypassed normal legal channels, but it was justice, even if it wasn't law." Marcus Whitfield stood slowly. His face was pale, his expression stunned. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "In all my research, I never found anything about—" He stopped, seeming unable to finish the sentence. "You wouldn't have," Emmett spoke up. "The truth was hidden deliberately. The official records show an accidental death. The newspaper article is deliberately vague. Everyone involved conspired to protect Anne Halvern and the other women who'd helped her." "But why?" Someone called from the audience. "Why hide it if it was justified?" Opal stood, using her walker for support. "Because in 1905, the law didn't protect women from their husbands. A man could beat his wife with impunity. Police wouldn't interfere in domestic matters. Women couldn't divorce without cause, and abuse often wasn't considered sufficient cause. If you were married to a violent man, you had no legal recourse." She pulled out a folded paper from her pocket. "This is a letter written by the sheriff in 1905. My grandmother kept it all these years. He wrote it after closing the investigation into Samuel Whitfield's death. She handed it to Mayor Thornton, who read it aloud. I know what happened on the night of January 12. I know why. I know who struck the blow, and I know it was necessary to save an innocent life. As sheriff, I should prosecute. As a human being, I cannot. These women have suffered enough. They deserve peace, not punishment. I am closing this case and taking this knowledge to my grave. May God forgive me if I'm wrong, but I believe justice was already served that night in the snow." The room erupted in murmurs. People turned to each other, arguing in whispers. Another elderly woman stood near the back. "My grandmother was helped by the Silent Sisters," she said clearly. "She never told me details, but she said they saved her life when she had nowhere else to turn. If what Mrs. Halvern says is true about this network of women, then we owe them honor, not judgment." A man in his 70s stood. "I heard my grandfather mention the Whitfield death once, said it was the best thing that ever happened to Anne Halvern, being freed from that man. I didn't understand what he meant at the time, but it makes sense now." More people began to speak, sharing fragments of family stories they'd heard over the years. Hints about the Silent Sisters, mentions of women helping women, vague references to the valley taking care of its own when the law wouldn't. The collective memory of the community was coming to life, validating what Trudy had revealed. Marcus Whitfield's lawyer tried to speak, to bring the focus back to legal technicalities, but Mayor Thornton held up his hand. "I think we've heard enough to understand what really happened. The question now is what we do with this knowledge." He looked at Marcus. "Mr. Whitfield, you came here seeking to reclaim property you believed was wrongfully taken from your family. What do you think now that you know the full story?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was heavy. "I think I'm ashamed of my ancestor. I think my family lost any claim to that property the day Samuel Whitfield raised his hand to his wife." He looked at Trudy. "I'm withdrawing my challenge. The land is yours, Mrs. Halvern. Rightfully yours." The room burst into applause. Marcus held up his hand. "But I'd like to request something, if I may." The room quieted. "I'd like to fund a historical marker for the Silent Sisters. Something that tells their story, honors what they did for women who had nowhere else to turn. My ancestor was a monster, but these women were heroes. That deserves to be remembered." More applause, louder this time. Trudy felt tears running down her face. She nodded, unable to speak. Emmett stood and addressed the crowd. "The Historical Society will work with Mr. Whitfield and Mrs. Halvern to create an appropriate memorial. We'll document the full story of the Silent Sisters, preserving it for future generations. What they did mattered. What they survived mattered. And it should never be forgotten." Opal raised her hand from where she sat. "My grandmother's diary and Mrs. Halvern's grandmother's journal should be donated to the Historical Society. Not hidden away, but preserved and made available for researchers. Let the truth be known." Trudy agreed immediately. "Yes, no more secrets, no more hiding." The mayor stood. "Then I believe this matter is settled. The property remains with Mrs. Halvern, and we as a community commit to honoring the truth of our history, difficult as it may be." He gavelled the meeting to a close, but nobody left. People crowded around Trudy, thanking her for sharing the story, sharing their own fragments of family history, expressing support and solidarity. And through it all, Trudy felt something she hadn't felt in 30 years. She felt like she belonged. 3 months later, on a clear September morning, Trudy stood beside Emmett at the edge of the homestead property. A small crowd had gathered for the dedication of the memorial. Marcus Whitfield had funded. The marker was simple but dignified, a bronze plaque mounted on a stone base, positioned near the cellar entrance. It read, "In memory of the Silent Sisters, 1904 to 1910, a network of women who protected each other when the law would not. They chose survival over silence, courage over compliance, and justice over oppression. May their strength be remembered and their sacrifices honored." Below that, the names of the 5 original members: Anne Whitfield Halvern, Iris Whitfield, Mary Garrison, Ruth Coleman, Margaret Hayes, and Lily Kendall. Marcus Whitfield had traveled from Denver for the dedication. He stood with Trudy and Emmett, his expression solemn. "My ancestor doesn't deserve to be remembered," he said quietly, "but the women who survived him do." After the ceremony, after the crowd dispersed and the town returned to its normal rhythm, Trudy and Emmett walked through the homestead. She decided to restore it not as a museum, but as a home. A place where the past and present could coexist, where truth didn't have to hide in cellars and sealed walls. "I'm going to live here," she told Emmett, "at least part of the year. Keep the cabin up in the mountains for when I need solitude, but make this place home too." "That sounds good," Emmett said. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I've been thinking about how I've spent 30 years working with history, documenting other people's lives, preserving other people's stories, but I haven't really been living my own life. Not fully." Trudy stopped walking and looked at him. "I let you go once because I thought I was supposed to," Emmett continued. "I thought respecting your grief meant letting you run. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of fighting for what I wanted, afraid of pushing, afraid of making things harder for you. Emmett, let me finish." He took her hand. "I'm older now, old enough to know that regret is worse than risk, old enough to say what I should have said 30 years ago. I love you, Trudy. I loved you then, and I love you now. And I'd like the chance to build something with you, if you're willing." Trudy felt her throat tighten. She'd spent 3 decades convinced she couldn't love anyone again, couldn't risk the loss. But standing here, on this property where her grandmother had survived the worst and built something beautiful anyway, she understood. Running from pain didn't protect you, it just meant you ran alone. "I'm willing," she said simply. Emmett smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and made him look young despite his grey hair. "Good. That's good." They walked to the cellar entrance, where the memorial plaque gleamed in the sunlight. Trudy had decided to keep the cellar as it was a reminder of survival, a testament to endurance. But she'd added electric lights and a proper door. No more sealing it away, no more hiding the truth. "My grandmother wore this until she died," Trudy said, pulling something from her pocket. "It was Anne's wedding ring, the one Ernest Halvern had given her in 1905. She'd found it among her grandfather's possessions, kept safe all these years." She held it up to the light. On the inside was an engraving she'd discovered just last week. "From darkness to light, 1905. They built a good life," Trudy said. "From the worst possible beginning, they built something good. Raised children, served this community, loved each other. They didn't let what happened define them." "No," Emmett agreed. "They let how they survived define them instead." Trudy slipped the ring onto her own finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. That evening, she returned to the motel to pack her things. She'd be moving into the homestead next week, once the basic repairs were complete. But tonight, she wanted to make one final entry in her own journal, a new one she'd started after finding her grandmother's. She wrote about the dedication ceremony, about the community's support, about Marcus Whitfield's grace in accepting the truth about his ancestor. She wrote about Emmett's confession and her own response, and then she wrote, "I came here looking for secrets and found truth instead. I came running from the past and found a way forward. My grandmother survived violence and built a life of love. I survived loss and built walls of isolation. But walls can come down. Isolation can end. The past can be honored without being repeated." She paused, thinking about the cellar and the memorial, about Anne's courage and Iris's loyalty, about Ernest's love and the silent sister's network of protection. "Sometimes the things we inherit are heavier than we realize," she wrote, "but sometimes they're also stronger. My grandmother gave me more than property. She gave me a legacy of survival, of choosing life over fear, of building something good from terrible circumstances. I'm going to honor that legacy, not by hiding it, but by living it, by choosing connection over isolation, by choosing truth over secrets, by choosing love over fear. She closed the journal and looked out the motel window at the mountains rising in the distance. Somewhere up there was her cabin, her 30 years of solitary living. It would still be there when she needed it. But for now, she had a homestead to restore, a community to join, and a man who loved her waiting for her to love him back. For the first time in decades, Trudy Halvern wasn't running from anything. She was running toward something instead. And that made all the difference.